Howdy, this is Browdy. This is the first lecture for photosynthesis and really of cell energy overall. So this year, because of just the weird schedule, we're kind of combining photosynthesis and cell respiration into one mega unit, so to speak, of cell energy. So we're kind of combining Unit 6 and Unit 7. So if you see this called a few different things, that's why. Now for this lecture, depending on how long it ends up taking, I'm going to keep my eye on the clock. I might try to get through this whole thing in one, but if it looks like it's going to be too long a video, I'll cut it kind of about halfway through. And so we'll see how it goes. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to jump right in. So let's talk about photosynthesis. Now, before we talk about photosynthesis itself, remember that we've kind of gotten pretty far into molecular biology at this point. We talked about the scientific method, and then cells and organelles, and then cell membranes, and DNA, RNA, proteins, and all that. Now we're going to take kind of a step back from the nucleus and ribosome and all that stuff and move over to the chloroplast. And so if you remember the chloroplast, remember that's in plants. So let's start by talking about plants. So first we have to talk about something called an autotroph. Auto is a prefix that means self. Troph is a suffix that means food. So autotroph is an organism that makes its own food or its own energy. And so plants and algae and cyanobacteria are examples of this. So you've probably heard auto and like autobiography, right? Which is a biography written by the person who wrote it. So it's written by themselves. So autotrophs are organisms that make their own energy or make their own food. We call those autotrophs. The opposite of that is a heterotroph. Hetero means other. So heterosexual, for example, right? So heterotrophs are organisms that eat other organisms. So they can't make their own food, so they eat other organisms that have either made their own food or have eaten other things that have made their own food, right? So all animals are examples of heterotrophs. So we, for example, are animals, and we either eat plants, which have made their own food, or we eat animals that have eaten plants, or we eat animals that have eaten animals that have eaten plants, right? So something initially made its own food, and then other things consume that. And then we get different levels of the food web, which is often called a trophic level, right? So hopefully we can see how that plays into one another. So autotrophs can make their food a few different ways, and the two we'll look at here are photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. Synthesis, remember, means make, like protein synthesis was making proteins. Photo means light, and chemo means chemical. So photosynthesis is using light to make food, and chemosynthesis is using chemical reactions to make food. Now, you'll notice that food and energy are kind of used interchangeably a lot of the time. And that's going to continue to be the case because eating food and digesting food is what gives us energy. So that's autotrophs and heterotrophs. Let's keep going. So to shift more into plants specifically, we'll start with the question, why do leaves change colors in the fall? Now, I'll see a bunch of different colors of leaves here, and personally I'm a fall person, so I love the fall. I love all the colors, and the reason that those colors change, we have to think about what happens in fall. Temperatures start to get colder, daylight gets less and less abundant, so the days get shorter, right? And those signal to trees that winter is coming. And so they need to conserve their resources. And so they start to conserve their resources by letting those leaves fall off and die, right? And as that happens, we start to see a change in the pigments that are seen in the leaves. So different pigments start to leave, other pigments that are normally covered up start to show up, like these we see here. But what is a pigment? A pigment is a molecule that absorbs certain wavelengths of light. So different pigments show us different colors. You've probably heard of pigments in terms of skin color or in paints or in art class or things like that. But a pigment itself is just a molecule that absorbs certain light or certain wavelengths of light. But what is a wavelength? Well, light often behaves as a wave. So you can think of like ocean waves, right? But a wave is essentially like a particle or something that moves like this. It's probably the easiest way to explain it. That moves in this pattern. Now, wavelength refers to how long one wave is. So the one I'm drawing here would be a long wavelength versus something like that, which would be a shorter wavelength. Really long wavelengths could be things like radio waves or microwaves or infrared. Really short waves could be things like X-rays or ultraviolet light. And so this spectrum, what we call the electromagnetic spectrum, these are all waves. They're kind of the same thing, but depending on their wavelength, they behave differently. We can see a very small portion of this spectrum, and the waves that we can see we call visible light. And so that ranges from colors like red, which has the biggest wavelength, to purple or violet, which has the shortest wavelength, and we can see everything in between. When we see all those colors at once, we call that white light, which is what all these lights are here. That's what's in school. Typically, you have those in your house. Beyond that are things like ultraviolet light and X-rays that we can't see. Below that are things like infrared and micro and radio waves that we can't see. But we can see this portion, and different colors correspond to different wavelengths or different sizes of waves. So the colors that we see in something, so this shirt being green and gray, for example, are wavelengths of light that are reflected by the pigments, not the colors that are absorbed. So remember, pigments are molecules that absorb light. But the colors that we see are the ones that are actually reflected, the colors that are not absorbed. And so to start as an example here, the main pigment in plants, well, first off, if you think plants, you immediately think green, because plants are almost always green, right? Why are they green? So plants have a pigment called chlorophyll, and it looks green because it absorbs every color of light other than green. So here we see a graph that shows different wavelengths of light measured in nanometers. That's just how we measure that size of wave. And then this is showing absorbance. So a taller peak means it absorbs more. So here, this is chlorophyll in these two peaks. And so this is saying in the violet to blue range, there's a lot of absorbance. It comes back down and there's virtually no absorbance in the green to yellow range. Then as you go up towards red, absorbance peaks again, meaning blue and red are absorbed very strongly, but green is not. Green is reflected. And so the color that we see, green, is because green wavelengths of light, or wavelengths of light that we know to be green, are reflected by that pigment. The other colors are absorbed. There's another pigment in plants that can look yellow, orange, or red, and we call those carotenoids. These absorb violet and blue and green light really well, and they don't at all absorb yellow, orange, or red light. And so, because they absorb these and reflect these are the colors that we see. And so, when a pigment absorbs light, it absorbs the energy that the light carries with it. That light is then used to make chemical energy in the process that we call photosynthesis. And we know that all living things need chemical energy to survive. So the way they get that energy to make these processes happen is by absorbing sunlight, because that carries energy with it. And so again, the colors that we see are the opposite of what they absorb. So this concept works if you think about wearing a t-shirt in the summer, right? If you wear a white t-shirt, it's going to be cool. And I think that's something that people often say is you want to wear white, light colors in the summer because they reflect light. So if you wear a white t-shirt, when we see something as white, we're seeing all the colors at once. And so a white t-shirt reflects every color and it looks white because of that. A black t-shirt is absorbing every color, so no light is reflected. Now, if it's absorbing every kind of light, that also means it's absorbing that energy as heat. And so black shirts get hot because they absorb all of that energy. White shirts stay cool because they reflect all of that energy. So hopefully that concept helps. Now, again, there are these different pigments here. So there's really two kinds of chlorophyll, but we'll consider them for now to just be green. So chlorophyll A and B are light and dark green, but chlorophyll is green. Carotenoids are often orange and yellow or even red. And anthocyanins could be purple, sometimes red, and I've got these listed over here. But for now, I would just maybe pause or screenshot, write that down, and we'll continue so we don't have to move back and forth. Excuse me. So again, chlorophyll looks green, carotenoids look yellow and orange, anthocyanins look red and purple, because those are the colors that are reflected. The other colors are what are absorbed. Now this is important because the light that they absorb is the energy that's used for photosynthesis. The reason plants have multiple pigments is because the more pigments they have, the more different kinds of light they can absorb. If they can absorb every kind of light, they have access to more energy for photosynthesis. Now in the fall, and I'm going to hold off on this video for now, but in the fall when leaves are changing colors, that's because as the green chlorophyll is less abundant and less clear as those leaves are dying, what's happening is we start to see the carotenoids and anthocyanins being expressed a little bit more strongly because the green is no longer covering those up. So now we're going to move into photosynthesis. And I will admit this page of notes gets a little confusing. It kind of moves back and forth. So maybe you write it all down now so you can just follow along with me. So photosynthesis has two main steps that we're going to talk about, and we really won't talk in that much detail about them. But first, let's consider the overall process of photosynthesis. So if you think about what a plant needs, plants need, so it's just a plant in your house, you need to set it somewhere that has access to sunlight. It needs carbon dioxide, because hopefully we know now that plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. And it'll also need water. So you water your plants, right? Or plants outside will die. The grass will die if it doesn't rain or get watered, right? Now, photosynthesis produces oxygen, and it also produces glucose, which is a sugar. So you could write this out as kind of an equation of sorts as carbon dioxide plus water plus sunlight or light energy give you or produce sugar and oxygen. And we can see that down here. But I also want you to be familiar with both versions of this equation. So this is the equation in like English terms. This is the chemistry version of the equation. And I want you to know that this is a chemical reaction, a chemical equation. And this is really one of the few only chemical equations I want you to know in this class. And it'll be important next unit as well. 6 CO2, which is carbon dioxide, plus 6 H2O. So these numbers represent how many of these molecules. So 6 carbon dioxide molecules plus 6 water molecules plus sunlight produce 1 glucose molecule and 6 oxygen molecules. And this whole process is taking place in an organelle in plant cells that we call the chloroplast. So chloroplasts are what make plants green, because chloroplasts are the part or are the organelle that contain pigments, that contain chlorophyll. So here you see a real picture of plant cells, and all these green things are the chloroplasts. So we can see how many there are per cell. If there's that many per cell and they're that green, it's no wonder that plants are green, right? So if here's our plant cell, we've got the large central vacuole, the endoplasmic reticulum, the nucleus, the Golgi apparatus, mitochondria, lysosome, cytoplasm, cell wall, cell membrane, all that good stuff. and the chloroplast. So if we look at the chloroplast specifically, there's a few different parts here, and we're going to talk just about a few of them. So here's our chloroplast, and this is the organelle that contains chlorophyll, which is the pigment that primarily drives photosynthesis. We've got a few parts. The first are the inner and outer membranes. So you'll notice here there are two membranes, and what they do is they enclose the chloroplast just like a cell membrane, and they allow molecules, especially sugars, to cross, just like a cell membrane, right? So an organelle membrane functions very similarly. It's a phospholipid bilayer. But why does it have two membranes? Hopefully you remember that chloroplasts and mitochondria are the two organelles that we believe are evidence of a theory called endosymbiosis, which is the theory that those got absorbed or engulfed by other cells for those to become organelles, which is where eukaryotes, we believe, came from. So those are the membranes. There's three other parts that we really care about. There are the thylakoids, which are these little discs. Each one of these little coin-like or pancake-like things is a thylakoid, and that's the thing that contains chlorophyll. There are grana, which are stacks of thylakoids. There are there is also the stroma, which is, spaced out for a second. The stroma is essentially the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. So really that's what we've got going on here. This is kind of the fluid outside of the thylakoids. And that, right there, is the chloroplast. That's all we really care about. Sorry for losing my train of thought there for a second. So we have the membranes, the thylakoids, the grana, which is the plural of granum, and then the stroma. And so we can see that all here on the notes as well. Now, like I said, there are two steps of photosynthesis. I think I'm going to go for this all in one big lecture. I think we'll make it happen. So photosynthesis is two steps: the light dependent and light independent. So as the name implies, the light dependent depends on having the sun. It uses sunlight. The light independent can happen without light. The light dependent reaction converts light energy to chemical energy. So technically it uses sunlight to split up water molecules. Energy is released, and that's stored as a molecule called ATP that we've talked about a few times in class. And then this is the specific equation for the first part. The light independent reaction stores energy in sugars. And so it uses that ATP and the carbon dioxide that it takes in to make sugar. So here's how we would break up that equation into those two different reactions. But I like to think of it this way. So if we look at our chloroplast here, in the first step, our inputs are light and water. That water comes into the cell through the roots in the plant, right? It comes into the cell, and the light energy breaks up those water molecules. And this is happening in the thylakoids, or the grana, right? The stacks. This is happening in here. And now, those water molecules get broken up. It releases oxygen, and it also produces ATP, which is a molecule we'll talk about a little bit later. But it produces ATP. That ATP acts as basically energy. Hopefully you remember this from the cell membrane unit. And it goes over to the light independent reaction, which is sometimes called the Calvin cycle. The ATP, along with another molecule we'll talk about briefly, interacts with the CO2, the carbon dioxide, to rearrange some carbons into glucose, which is sugar. And that's really all it is. In the light dependent reaction, again, light comes in and breaks up water, and it produces oxygen and ATP. And this happens in the thylakoids. The light independent reaction is happening in the stroma, the cytoplasm of the chloroplast, essentially. And that ATP and CO2 are interacting to rearrange and produce glucose. And those are the 2 steps. That's all I really want you to know. And again, here's just a summary of it. So the first step converts sunlight to chemical energy in the form of ATP. The second step, the light-independent reaction, makes the sugar. And I'm realizing now on the notes that this says sunlight and water both times, and that is a mistake. I apologize. I'll fix that before I upload the notes fully, but since I'm noticing it now in the video, it uses carbon dioxide and ATP to make glucose. And it happens in the stroma. I apologize for that typo. I don't know why that happened, but hey, I'm glad I caught it now. So, this again just summarizes these, but I'm going to skip past these for the sake of time. So now, we're on to really the last page of new stuff. So we need to talk about the energy that living things use. So we're going to start by talking actually about calories. So you've probably heard about calories in food. How many calories does this have? Yada yada, right? A calorie is actually the amount of energy that we can get from what we eat. So if we eat something that has a bunch of calories, that means we can get a lot of energy from that, provided we burn those calories. Now, technically, the food calories that we talk about are called kilo or kilocalories, which is 1,000 scientific calories. A scientific calorie, the definition of a calorie, is the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. Now that's very specific, and I'm not imagining that when you're calculating your calories for the day that you're thinking about this. But because we're talking about cellular energy, I think that's useful and relevant to know. But now let's talk about how molecules store energy. So I've mentioned ATP a few times in a few units. Let's finally talk about it. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. The tri means 3. That's ATP. Here's an ATP molecule. Now, energy in ATP is stored in what we call phosphate bonds, which are bonds between these phosphate groups. So we've got adenosine, we have a ribose sugar, and then we have 3 phosphate groups. These bonds store energy, and the third bond specifically stores a lot of energy. So when that last phosphate group is broken off, when that bond breaks, energy is released. Because remember, bonds are energy, and so when bonds break, energy is released. A lot of energy is released when this bond breaks. And so if a cell needs energy to do something, for example, active transport, if we remember that, right, to push something against a concentration gradient, that takes energy. And that energy comes from this bond breaking. And so this would leave ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. Di means 2. Sorry, there's a weird kind of rattling in the back. I'm not sure if you can hear that, but if so, I apologize. So ADP is diphosphate, 2 phosphates. There's another similar molecule that's used in this process called NADPH. So just like ATP, it has stored energy. When that hydrogen, the H, comes off, it releases energy, right? Just like ATP breaking. Once that happens, we get NADP+, we call it, and that's what we see here. Now, when light energy breaks up water into oxygen, it also produces hydrogen, and that H replenishes NADPH. So ATP and NADPH and their used up counterparts are kind of like a rechargeable battery, right? Or maybe like a power bank or a battery pack for your phone. Excuse me, that was probably loud. Now, when you use a battery pack and you drain the battery, it will charge up your phone, but now you have an empty battery or a dead battery. So you have to charge it back up so then you can use it again to provide energy another time. And that's just how ATP and NADPH are. You donate a phosphate group or a hydrogen, you break those bonds to produce energy, but then they're uncharged. So you have to give another phosphate group, or you have to give another H to make them usable again. So lastly, the last real topic in all of this is, what do plants do with all that sugar that they make? Because if the goal of photosynthesis is to make sugar, what do they do with it? They make carbohydrates, or as you probably know them, carbs. So carbs are things like starchy foods, and I love carbs. So potatoes, rice, bread, pasta, cereal. Look at this just delicious picture right here, right? So carbs produce a lot of quick energy, meaning that the energy held in these bonds is really readily accessible. And so what a carbohydrate is actually a long chain of sugars. So this is glucose. The C6 means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. There's 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens as well. C6H12O6. Now these can be linked together. And a long chain of sugars is what we call a carbohydrate. And these can release energy really quickly. Remember that a monomer is what we call a single piece of a molecule, and that a polymer is a chain of the same pieces, or of the same monomers linked together. So a sugar is a monomer, and a carbohydrate is the polymer. So carbohydrates are made up entirely of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Just 3 elements make up all of these sugars, right? Everything you see here is made up of one of those. So these little dots here are carbons. Now they all have the same ratio of these molecules. For every 1 carbon, there will be 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. And that is all of the new stuff for the whole unit. So we'll go a little bit further, but that's all of the notes. Starches, you've heard of, starchy foods, right? We just talked about. Those are branched chains of sugars, and these store a lot of energy. And so the bonds that connect the sugars and starches are really easy to break, which makes them easy to digest, which is where we can get a lot of that energy. Cellulose, on the other hand, is also a long chain of sugars, and this is the sugar that gives plants structure and strength. But the bonds that connect these are really hard to break, so it's hard to digest. So since we can't really digest cellulose, we need cellulase enzymes to help our bodies digest that. Now that's just kind of for funsies to know, right? Just to keep it relevant. Now this last page of the notes, I'm going to make sure I keep this under 30 minutes. This is just a review of what's already been on there, so I'm hoping that you can fill this out on your own. I'm not going to talk about that. Same here with the parts of the chloroplast. Now this is you just summarizing the steps in your own words, so you can write it like I did, or hopefully you can come up with that on your own. And that is all of photosynthesis. I opted to make it one lecture just to keep things easy to find. It's a little long. If you made it to the end, thank you for taking the time to follow along. I hope this has been helpful. And that is all of photosynthesis. So as always, if you have questions, you know how to get a hold of me. Canvas, email, live meetings, whatever it is. And I will talk to you very soon.